Sari had been in the palace for as long as she could clearly remember, though there were faint flickers in her mind of a home that smelled faintly of river reeds and wood smoke. Those earliest memories were like the thin light that slipped between the slats of the servants' dormitory shutters before dawn, soft, pale, and gone the moment you tried to hold them. She was told she had come to the palace at the age of 8, brought by a merchant's cart that traded in more than goods. Her parents, long swallowed by poverty and a failing harvest, had chosen what they believed to be the least cruel path, surrendering her to the palace as a servant in exchange for enough coin to keep her siblings alive another winter. Whether they had survived that winter she never knew. Letters were not permitted for those in her position, and so her family became a name she mouthed at night, a set of faces that blurred more each year. Her life in the palace was a rhythm of tasks and commands, a cadence set not by bells or the sun but by the whims of those who towered over her. Sari's hands told the story of that life better than any words could. They were calloused in thick patches from hours of scrubbing floors with rough straw brushes, from wringing linens until the fibers thinned, from carrying trays of silver platters that pressed cruelly into her skin. The edges of her fingers bore faint scars from cuts sustained in the kitchens, tiny burns from the oil that leapt from boiling pans, thin lines from knives slipped on slick vegetable skins. In winter her knuckles split and bled in the cold, and in summer her palms stayed raw from endless work. But those hands were also steady and strong, capable of balancing a full tray while stepping over the intricate skirts of nobles without a single drop spilling. That steadiness was her pride, though she never spoke of it. Her strength, like the rest of her, was quiet. Sari was not one for raised voices or defiant glares. She had learned early that the palace could grind such things out of a person until only resignation remained. Yet her quiet was not the silence of surrender, it was the quiet of someone who understood how to survive in a place where survival itself was an act of defiance. She measured her words, kept her head bowed in the presence of nobles, and avoided drawing attention unless it was impossible to do otherwise. There was power in invisibility, though it came at the cost of being overlooked in every other way. The small cruelties she endured were countless, and they rarely came in the form of blows or shouts. Instead, they were the 1,000 little barbs that seemed harmless to those who delivered them. Court attendants would hand her the heaviest baskets and then watch, amused, as she struggled to carry them across the marble courtyard. Noble ladies would wrinkle their noses when she passed too close, even though she scrubbed herself clean every morning with cold water and a sliver of coarse soap. More than once, she had been ordered to polish a floor she had already cleaned to a shine, simply because someone had the urge to give her another hour of bending and scrubbing. She learned to take insults without letting them fester inside her. Words like mudfoot and beggar's brat lost their sting over the years, becoming the background noise of her existence. Still, every now and then, one would slip past her defenses, lodging like a splinter in the flesh of her mind. On those nights, she would lie awake in her narrow bed in the servants' dormitory, staring at the dark beams overhead and tracing the calluses on her own hands as though reminding herself of the work she had endured, the things she had built her strength upon. The palace itself was a world both beautiful and cruel. Its walls were carved from pale stone that caught the sun and glowed like fire at dusk. The air inside was always scented with a mixture of beeswax from the polished floors, incense from the great hall, and the faint perfume of the nobles who glided through the corridors. Sari often marveled at the colors of the silks and velvets they wore, fabrics she touched only when folding laundry or carrying garments to be altered. She thought of them as creatures from another realm, their soft hands and unlined brows so distant from the life she knew. Though she served many in the palace, her duties often placed her near the queen's wing. Queen Athelia was not cruel in the obvious way some nobles were, but her indifference could cut just as deep. To her, servants were part of the scenery, expected to appear when needed, vanish when dismissed, and never intrude upon the realm of her notice. Sari had spent long afternoons standing silently in the queen's chambers, holding a tray of refreshments until her arms ached, while Athelia entertained visiting dignitaries or inspected bolts of fabric for new gowns. The queen never learned her name, though Sari knew every tilt of her head, every shift in her expression that signaled when her mood was turning sour. The other attendants in the queen's service took their cues from her aloofness. They whispered about Sari when they thought she could not hear, remarking on her plain features, her rough hands, and the way her brown hair never quite stayed in place no matter how tightly she braided it. They laughed over her mended dresses, the patches at her elbows. In moments when there was no direct work to be done, they would invent errands for her, sending her down the long, twisting servant corridors for items they didn't truly need, just to watch her hurry away and return breathless. Yet even with all of this, there were moments of grace in her days, small enough to pass unnoticed by anyone else. The warmth of the kitchen when she slipped in to collect a tray on a winter morning. The brief glimmer of sunlight through a high window in the laundry room. The sound of distant music when the palace hosted a celebration, muffled by thick walls but sweet all the same. In those moments, Sari would let herself imagine that there was more to life than carrying out orders, that perhaps the palace walls would not always define the limits of her world. She carried these quiet moments the way one might carry a hidden locket, close to her heart and shielded from harm. They were what kept her from becoming entirely hollow. They, and the small rebellions she allowed herself, like pausing for half a heartbeat longer than necessary to enjoy the warmth of a sunbeam, or letting her gaze linger on the distant hills when she crossed the outer courtyard, imagining the world beyond them. She was used to enduring, to being the one at the bottom of every order and every jest. What she did not yet know was that her calloused hands and quiet strength were not simply the marks of a servant's life, they were the foundation of something that would soon turn the palace's order upside down. And though she could not foresee it, every small cruelty she endured was shaping her for the moment when she would finally be seen, not as part of the scenery, but as the force that would alter it. The queen's cruelty did not erupt like a sudden storm. It crept in like ivy, winding itself around Sari's days until it was impossible to see where the ordinary slights of servitude ended and deliberate malice began. At first, Sari thought it was merely the natural way of palace life. After all, nobles had always handed her impossible burdens, always watched with idle amusement as she strained under their orders. But with Queen Athelia, the nature of the commands shifted. There was a precision to them, as if each was chosen not for necessity, but for the sting it would bring. The change began when the queen first truly looked at her. Sari had been pouring tea during a midday gathering of noblewomen, standing just behind the queen's right shoulder so she could refill cups without disrupting the conversation. She had felt the queen's eyes pass over her before, in the way one might glance at a piece of furniture, but that day was different. Athelia's gaze lingered. It was not warmth she saw there, nor simple disinterest. It was the cool calculation of someone who had noticed something they wished they hadn't. Sari was not a beauty in the traditional sense the court celebrated, but there was something about her that drew the eye if one looked closely. The curve of her cheek, the quiet elegance in the way she moved, the way her dark eyes seemed to reflect light even in the shadowed corners of the room. She had never thought of herself in such terms, but Athelia did. The queen was a woman accustomed to being the jewel of every chamber she entered, her golden hair and flawless skin the silent measure against which others were compared. For her to notice even a flicker of grace in a servant girl was, in her mind, an affront. It began subtly. Sari was assigned the most visible tasks during court gatherings, standing near the throne with a tray until her arms burned, holding heavy curtains open for hours during receptions so the breeze could cool the guests. The queen never acknowledged her, but Sari could feel those cold blue eyes turning toward her from time to time, assessing. There was no praise when she endured these tasks without complaint. Instead, the weight of them seemed to grow heavier with each passing week. Then came the petty humiliations. Sari was ordered to kneel on the hard marble floor while polishing already shining tiles in full view of visiting dignitaries. She was made to carry messages from the queen to courtiers who were only a few paces away, ensuring she crossed the entire chamber while all eyes followed. The queen's commands were never outright cruel enough to provoke scandal, just enough to grind away at dignity, one grain at a time. The incident that burned itself into Sari's memory began on a day when the court was assembled for a public audience. Nobles stood in their jeweled finery, and petitioners from the city waited in a long line to be heard. The air was heavy with summer heat. Even the high, arched windows could not draw in enough breeze to cool the hall. Athelia, perched elegantly on her throne, shifted in her seat with a delicate sigh. Her gaze swept the room, and when it landed on Sari, a thin smile curved her lips, one that did not reach her eyes. "Sari," she said, her voice carrying easily over the murmur of the gathered crowd. "The air is stifling. Bring me something to fan myself with." Sari bowed and retreated quickly toward the gardens, where the palace kept fresh branches and flowers for decoration. She had expected to return with palm fronds or woven fans as was customary. But as she stepped into the shade of the garden arcade, she found one of the queen's ladies-in-waiting already waiting for her. In her hands, the woman held a bundle of freshly cut branches from a hawthorn bush, their long supple stems lined with vicious, gleaming thorns. "The queen's orders," the lady said, her tone too neutral to be anything but complicit. "You are to use these." Sari hesitated for a fraction of a second, the sharp scent of the freshly broken branches stinging her nose. She knew hawthorn well, its thorns could pierce flesh as easily as cloth. "These will tear, my lady," she said quietly, unsure if she meant they would tear her own hands or the queen's silks. The lady only smiled, a thin, knowing curve of the lips, and placed the branches in Sari's hands. "Then take care not to let them." Returning to the great hall, Sari felt the eyes of the court upon her, though she did not dare meet them. She approached the queen's throne and knelt, raising the cruel bundle of branches. The thorns were already pricking at the tender skin between her thumb and forefinger, even though she gripped them as carefully as she could. She began to move them back and forth, stirring the air toward Athelia's serene face. From a distance, it may have looked like a simple act of service, a servant fanning her queen with fragrant greenery. Up close, Sari could feel the sting of each movement as the thorns shifted against her palms. They bit into her skin in tiny, burning jabs, leaving faint lines of red that deepened the longer she worked. She kept her expression still, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond the queen's shoulder, refusing to let her pain become part of the spectacle. Athelia, however, was watching her with quiet satisfaction. Each deliberate sweep of the branches seemed to amuse her, as though the sight of those thorns drawing blood in silence was a private performance for her alone. Every now and then she would adjust her position, forcing Sari to shift her angle and press the thorns more tightly against her grip. The hall continued its business, petitions heard, nobles whispering in the corners, while Sari endured. It was not lost on her that the queen had chosen this method over countless others. There were many ways to cool oneself in the summer heat: silk fans, feathered fans, servants with gentle palm leaves. But hawthorn was different. Its branches were beautiful in a cruel way, the white blossoms sweet against the jagged thread of their spines. They were the perfect symbol for the queen's command, something that appeared ornamental yet concealed pain beneath the surface. Minutes stretched into an hour, and the sweat on Sari's temples mingled with the sting of her scraped hands. She thought of the kitchen basin where she would later wash the blood away, of the cold water biting into the small wounds. She thought of the satisfaction on the queen's face and wondered what it was in her presence that so provoked Athelia's envy. She was just a servant, clothed in plain linen, her hair braided to keep it from her eyes. Yet somehow that was enough. When at last the queen dismissed her with a flick of her fingers, Sari bowed low, careful not to let the branches shift and tear her further. She carried them back to the gardens, her hands aching, and left them on the stone bench beneath the shade of a cypress. She stood there for a moment, flexing her fingers, watching tiny beads of blood well up where the thorns had grazed her. The pain was sharp but clean, unlike the slow erosion of dignity she endured each day. It was in that moment, with the sting still fresh, that she realized the queen's cruelty had shifted from mere dismissal to something pointed and personal. And while Sari did not yet know how the wind itself would turn against such malice, a small, steady resolve began to take root in her heart, a knowledge that she could endure more than the queen expected, and that endurance could be its own quiet weapon. The branches were heavier than they looked. Not in weight alone, but in the way they bit into her hands with every shift of her grip. The hawthorn stems were supple and long, covered in clusters of small leaves and delicate white blossoms whose sweetness filled the air. But for every blossom, there was a thorn, long, black-tipped, and cruelly angled to catch skin no matter how carefully she tried to avoid them. When she first lifted them, Sari had thought she might find a way to hold the stems just so, curling her fingers in a manner that would keep the sharpest points turned outward. It was a fleeting hope. The queen did not sit still. She shifted on her throne, turning her head, leaning her shoulder, forcing Sari to adjust the angle of her fanning again and again. Each adjustment meant sliding the stems against her palms, and each slide left another thin line of fire on her skin. The court pretended not to notice, though she could feel their attention like the weight of a second sun. They were adept at ignoring the small cruelties that oiled the gears of palace life. If their eyes flickered toward her, it was only for a heartbeat before they looked away again, back to the glitter of jewels, the hum of gossip, the petitions being read aloud. It was as though her pain existed in a thin layer of reality only she occupied. The air she stirred with each slow sweep was cool against the queen's skin, but it carried with it the faint scent of blood, hers. She could smell it now beneath the blossoms, a metallic whisper she prayed no one else caught. Sari's fingers were starting to numb in places where the thorns pressed most deeply, a dull ache settling in her wrists from the constant motion. She thought of the calluses that lined her hands from years of work, wondering if they were any match for the sharpness of hawthorn. They were not. Athelia's eyes lingered on her in that way again, studying her as one might study a bird struggling in a net. "Slower," the queen murmured as though savoring a glass of wine. Sari obeyed, her arm muscles quivering as she lessened the speed of her fanning, drawing out the moment. The slower she moved, the more the branches shifted, and the more the thorns sought new places to pierce. She could feel the sweat at the nape of her neck, trickling down between her shoulder blades. Her jaw was tight, her lips pressed together to hide the tension that was building there. She would not give the queen the satisfaction of a flinch. That, she knew, was part of the game. The queen's satisfaction came not only from causing pain, but from making her display it, to let the court see her struggle. Sari would not yield that. Time was not measured in minutes for her now, but in the count of breaths between each twist of her wrists. She found herself focusing on the smallest of things to keep her mind from the sting: the uneven rhythm of a petitioner's speech before the throne, the dull gleam of a silver goblet on the banquet table, the faint murmur of wind through the high windows. She built a small fortress in her mind, brick by brick, and placed herself inside it. Still, the fortress could not block the creeping fatigue. Her fingers began to tremble, and once she nearly let the branches slip from her grasp. A thorn caught on the side of her thumb, slicing deeper than any of the others, and she felt the warmth of blood pool in the tiny cut. She kept her face smooth, lowering her eyes as though in humility rather than in an effort to hide the pain. She thought of her village, of the days when her hands knew only the feel of soil and water, of weaving mats from river reeds. Those tasks had been hard, but the hardness had purpose. It made things grow, made things useful. This was a different hardness. Pointless meant only to diminish her. And yet, the very pointlessness of it gave her a strange clarity. If this task existed only to make her suffer, then every moment she endured it without breaking was a quiet victory. The courtiers might never know the price of the fan's gentle breeze, but she would. Her blood was mixing with the blossoms now, invisible to all but her. She wondered if the hawthorn would drink it in, if it would remember her touch when it was discarded later in the gardens. Her arm ached with the slow, steady motion, but she kept the rhythm, refusing to falter even when the queen leaned closer, her voice soft enough for only Sari to hear. "Do you feel it?" Athelia asked, almost lazily, as though the question were about the summer heat and not the barbs digging into her flesh. "Yes, my queen," Sari replied, her voice low, measured, the words neither submissive nor defiant. She knew the queen wanted to see a crack. She gave her none. It felt as though the duty would never end, but eventually the queen grew bored, as tyrants often did when their games no longer yielded visible entertainment. With a flick of her fingers she dismissed Sari. No word of thanks, no glance of acknowledgement, only the next petitioner called forward to take Sari's place in the queen's attention. Sari stepped back, bowing low, keeping the thorn branches upright so the blood would not drip on the polished marble. She walked from the hall in measured steps, every eye on her back until she reached the garden doors. Only then did she let herself exhale, only then did she allow her shoulders to drop. In the quiet shade of the garden, she laid the branches down on a stone bench. Her palms were dotted with tiny punctures, some weeping bright red, others already clotting into dark specks. The skin along her fingers felt raw, as if the thorns had left an echo beneath the surface. She dipped her hands into the cool water of the garden basin, watching the blood swirl away in ribbons, vanishing into the ripples. The pain was still there, but so was something else, a quiet, stubborn flame that had survived the queen's test. She had been made into a spectacle, yet she had denied the queen her triumph. She had not broken. And as she pressed her wet hands to her cheeks, feeling the sting subside beneath the cold, she thought of how even thorn branches could stir more than air. The first time the wind stirred, it was subtle, so faint that most in the grand hall took no notice. The court was deep in its routines, the clink of goblets, the shuffle of slippers on marble, the droning petitions read aloud to the queen. Yet between those familiar sounds, there came a low sigh that seemed to pass through the space without a source. Sari, standing near the open garden doors with her wounded hands hidden in the folds of her skirt, felt it first, not as a cooling draft, but as something deliberate, a slow exhalation that curled around her like a question. The tall silk banners along the walls shivered. The movement was wrong for the season. It was a still summer afternoon, the kind where the air outside sat heavy and unmoving. Yet here in the palace, a current of air wound its way between the pillars, slipping past guards and courtiers without so much as rustling their hair, until it reached her. The breeze brushed her wrists where the thorn cuts burned, as though it had chosen that exact place to touch. She closed her eyes for half a breath, feeling an odd comfort in it, like cool fingers laid over a fever. Others began to notice when the great bronze braziers flanking the dais flickered. Flames bent sharply, their smoke drawn in one direction toward the throne. The queen's gaze narrowed slightly, but she said nothing, simply adjusting her posture as though no unnatural current of air could unsettle her. Still, there was a faint line of tension at the corner of her mouth. The wind returned moments later, stronger this time, winding through the hall in a path that defied sense. It did not spill evenly across the floor as a normal draft might. Instead it wove, threading through the legs of benches and sweeping between the feet of those assembled. Servants glanced over their shoulders, certain that someone had passed too close, only to find no one there. Sari's heart picked up pace. The sensation was unmistakable. It was circling her, returning to her as if drawn to the quiet hurt she carried. It brushed over her cuts again, cool and purposeful. Her breath caught. She dared not move, afraid that whatever this was might vanish if she broke the moment. The thorns had stolen her voice hours earlier, but the wind seemed to be listening to something deeper than speech, something beneath her silence. By the time the petitioners finished their pleas, the air in the hall had shifted entirely. It was no longer merely a place of stone and gold, but something charged, thick with the sense of being watched, though not by mortal eyes. The courtiers whispered now, their glances darting to the windows, to the high open arches where sunlight spilled in. But outside the trees stood motionless. This wind belonged only to the palace. It moved in strange pulses, almost like breathing. Each time it passed near the queen, it swelled slightly, enough to lift the sheer veil she wore over her shoulders, enough to make her reach up and smooth it back in irritation. At first, she dismissed it with a flick of her hand to the attendants, a silent order to close unseen doors. But the attendants returned shaking their heads. Every entrance was already shut, every latch secured. The murmurs grew. Some of the older servants made discreet signs against ill fortune. A few stepped back toward the walls as though wanting distance from the strange presence curling through the air. Sari stood still, feeling the wind graze her cheek now, lingering there for a moment before flowing away again. She had the wild thought that it was learning the shape of her face, the sound of her breath, the smell of her blood. When it returned yet again, the movement changed. It began to circle the throne itself, a slow spiral that caught the queen's hair and sent it lifting in defiance of gravity. Gasps rose from the crowd. The air here was heavier, cooler, scented faintly with the same hawthorn blossoms Sari had fanned earlier, but sharper, wilder, as if the flowers themselves had grown teeth. The queen's eyes hardened. "Who has allowed this?" she demanded, her voice cutting across the hall. No one answered, no one could. This was no servant's doing, no prank from some bold courtier. The wind responded not to orders but to something else entirely. It was then that Sari realized. The rhythm of the gusts matched the rhythm of her own pulse, fast and urgent. Every time her heart clenched with the memory of the thorns, the breeze seemed to sharpen, whipping a little harder around the queen. She tried to still herself, to calm her breathing, but the thought of the pain, of the blood on the blossoms, was enough to send the air surging again. The hall no longer felt like a place of order. The tapestries rippled, the candle flames guttered wildly, and the murmurs swelled into a low, nervous hum. Even the guards shifted uneasily, their hands tightening on spear shafts as though they could strike down a thing with no body. The queen's lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time since Sari had known her, there was a flicker, not fear perhaps but unease. And the wind, as though sensing that unease, lingered, curling tighter, colder, whispering in a language that had no sound, a language only the skin could understand. It was not finished. Not yet. It began without warning, in that strange, suspended hush after the last courtier's words had faded. Sari still held the thorn branches, her palms raw and stinging beneath the carefully hidden folds of her sleeves. The queen reclined on her cushioned seat, eyes half-lidded in satisfaction, as if nothing unnatural had been winding through the hall moments ago. But the wind had not left, it had simply waited. A faint shift in the air pressed against Sari's back, lifting a strand of her hair from her neck. She felt it gather behind her, coiling like a cat before it leaps. When she lifted the thorn branches to resume her humiliating task, the air surged forward, spilling past her hands and catching the leaves in a sudden violent swirl. The branches shivered as though alive. Then, instead of the gentle fanning motion she tried to control, the wind wrenched the stems from her grip and spun them in a whip-like arc. Thorns sliced the air in a hiss, and the breeze that should have cooled the queen instead flung the branches toward her face. Gasps broke through the hall as the queen recoiled. The thorns grazed the silk of her veil, snagging threads and tearing them into curling ribbons that drifted to the floor. A single bright bead of blood welled along her jawline where a thorn had kissed skin. She clapped a hand to the spot, her eyes flashing with disbelief and rage. But the wind was no longer obeying the expected rules of the court, or of nature. It spun the thorn branches away from the throne only to send them whipping back again, each sweep guided with uncanny precision. Nobles seated nearby yelped as the sharpened tips caught on their embroidered sleeves, pulling free threads of gold and crimson. The intricate patterns on their garments unraveled in seconds, the delicate silks shredding as if they were no stronger than spiderwebs. A courtier in a jeweled mantle staggered back, clutching his arm where a thorn had scored a thin line into his skin. Another noble cried out as her pearl necklace snapped, scattering beads across the marble with a sound like falling hail. The wind carried the sting of the thorns across the room, quick as a whip crack, too quick for anyone to track, too precise to be an accident. Sari stood frozen, her empty hands trembling. She had not moved, she had not commanded any of this. Yet the air around her pulsed as if it recognized her pain, her humiliation, and had decided to answer in kind. Each time the queen tried to stand, the gusts lashed at her skirts, tangling them around her legs and forcing her back into the chair. The more she flinched, the more the branches seemed to dance at her expense, brushing her cheeks, tugging at her hair, slicing fresh pinpricks of red along her forearms. The courtiers tried to scatter, but the wind did not let them flee untouched. A jeweled belt here, a satin sash there, each caught and torn until the hall glittered with discarded finery. The air was thick with the scent of crushed blossoms from the thorn branches, sweet but edged with the copper tang of blood. Some attendants dropped to their knees, covering their heads as if to pray. Others pressed themselves flat to the walls, afraid of drawing the wind's attention. Yet it did not strike indiscriminately. The force moved with intent, targeting only those who had once laughed at Sari's expense, those whose whispers and sneers had followed her through the palace corridors. Sari felt her breath coming faster, the beat of her heart matched by the rhythm of the gusts. It was as if the wind was drawing power from her memories, every sharp word, every mocking glance, every silent endurance. For years she had swallowed her pain, tucked it away like stones at the bottom of a deep well. Now that well had cracked, and the air itself poured out in her defense. The queen's voice rang through the chaos, sharp and commanding, "Stop this!" Her words were swallowed instantly, flung back at her with a rush of air that tore the pins from her hair. Dark strands spilled across her face, whipped by the same thorns she had once placed in Sari's hands. She raised her arms to shield herself, but the branches seemed to dance through every gap, leaving shallow red marks wherever they passed. A strange silence fell then, not of peace but of a storm holding its breath. The wind pulled back, gathering in the center of the hall, carrying the branches high above the queen's head. For a moment they hung there, trembling in the unseen current, their thorns gleaming in the light from the high windows. Then with a final rush the air drove them down, not to pierce but to land in Sari's open hands. The branches lay still now, the wind settling into nothing more than the faintest breeze curling through the room. The courtiers stood frozen, their fine clothes torn, their faces marked by the sting of thorns. The queen's breathing was ragged, her posture no longer that of an untouchable ruler. And Sari, still standing, still silent, held the branches with steady hands. The air was warm again, ordinary, but something unspoken had shifted in the hall. Those who had mocked her now looked at her with a different kind of gaze. Not pity, not exactly fear, but the knowledge that something beyond them had chosen to stand on her side. The wind had spoken, and its voice had been sharp as any thorn. The cry that burst from the queen's throat cut through the great hall like the crack of a whip. It was not the dignified, controlled voice the court was used to hearing, but a raw, startled sound, half pain, half outrage. Her hand clutched at her jaw where a thin trickle of blood glistened, the crimson stark against her powdered skin. The thorn-slashed fabric of her gown hung in uneven strips, her crown tilted askew as if the wind had tried to shake it loose. For a heartbeat no one moved. The courtiers, draped in jewels and silk, stared in stunned silence, their mouths slightly open, their eyes darting between the queen and the young servant standing rigid at her side. Then the murmurs began, low and fevered, rippling through the crowd like the first shiver before a storm. "Witchcraft," hissed a sharp-featured nobleman in emerald robes, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and accusation. "No, no, it is the gods," muttered another, an elderly lady whose rings clinked as her hands shook. "It is justice. I have seen this in the old stories. When the innocent are wronged, the wind itself can rise in their defense." The words spread, mingling and colliding, until the hall seemed full of two clashing tides, one calling for punishment, the other speaking of omens and divine intervention. Some crossed themselves or touched talismans at their throats, unwilling to take chances either way. Through it all, Sari stood frozen, the thorn branches heavy in her raw, scraped hands. Her breath came shallow and fast, her heart pounding in her ears. She had not willed this to happen, she could not even explain it. Yet the moment she had felt the last gust of wind place the branches back into her grip, she'd known it was not a simple accident. The queen's eyes locked on her, hard and gleaming. The weight of that gaze was worse than any slap. But Sari did not speak. She knew better than to try. The queen would twist any words into further proof of guilt. And besides, what could she say? That the heir had turned against its mistress and chosen a servant instead? The court would laugh, or worse. Her fingers spasmed, the sharp thorns biting into her palms again. With a sudden, almost desperate motion, she let the branches fall. They clattered to the marble floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the half-silence, as though the entire court had been holding its breath to hear it. The queen flinched at the noise, then straightened, forcing composure into her posture. "Seize her," she began, but the words faltered under the weight of dozens of watching eyes. Because while the queen spoke, the whispers had shifted. Too many had seen what had happened. Not just the blood, not just the torn silk, but the way the wind had moved. They had felt it themselves, brushing their own skin, nicking their own finery, singling them out for their past laughter at Sari's expense. And there was a strange sort of guilt settling in among them now, an unease that no command from the queen could quite cut through. One young courtier, pale and wide-eyed, bent to pick up a torn piece of the queen's veil from the floor. He held it up as if it might tell him a secret. "The thorns struck against the wind," he murmured, more to himself than anyone. It was not the girl's doing. It could not be. Others nodded in hushed agreement, while a few edged toward the great doors, as if distance from the scene might save them from whatever forces had been unleashed. A cluster of older nobles stood together, muttering about the palace's ancient omens, signs that came only when the ruler had crossed a line against the innocent. Sari lowered her gaze, her dark hair falling forward to hide her expression. She did not move, not even when the guards shifted uncertainly, looking from the queen to the churning crowd. She was trembling, whether from fear, exhaustion, or the aftershock of the strange power that had rushed through the hall, she could not say. The queen's lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. She wanted to restore control, to crush whatever sympathy might be taking root among the courtiers, but the sight of their uneasy faces seemed to bind her tongue. No one had dared defy her openly, yet something fragile and dangerous had shifted in that moment, like a crack in marble that might spread with the smallest pressure. From the back of the hall, a voice rose above the murmuring. "Perhaps the wind is tired of carrying cruelty." It was an old court scribe, his hands ink-stained and trembling but his gaze steady. The queen's glare sliced toward him, but the damage was already done. The words spread, repeated in different mouths, taking on their own life. Sari said nothing. She stood in the center of it all, feeling the last traces of the wind curling around her ankles like a protective animal. She didn't know why it had come to her aid, but she knew one thing with sudden clarity. The queen's power was no longer absolute, not after today. The courtiers had seen something they could not unsee. And even in her silence, her voice had been heard. The queen's voice rose again, this time sharpened with fury to mask the faint tremor beneath. "Seize her," she cried, jabbing a ring-laden finger toward Sari. The jewels glittered like shards of ice under the torchlight, but her command did not ring with the same certainty it once would have. Still, the two palace guards at the nearest column started forward, their armor clinking, their hands tightening around their spears. "She carries a curse," the queen declared, letting the words swell to fill the vaulted chamber. "Did you not see it? Did you not feel the wind bite at me as she fanned? This is no accident. This is sorcery aimed at the throne itself." Her accusation rippled through the gathered courtiers like a thrown stone into still water. Whispers swirled, overlapping, some carrying tones of belief, others skepticism. A few faces were pale with genuine fear, others wore the guarded expressions of people carefully considering which side to take. Sari took a slow breath. Her scraped hands hung loosely at her sides, the sting of the thorns still fresh in her skin. She could feel every heartbeat pounding in her fingertips, but her voice, when she spoke, was even and quiet. "I obeyed," she said. "I held what I was given. I stood where I was told. I did what you commanded, nothing more." The queen's eyes narrowed. "You dare answer me so calmly, girl? That alone betrays your guilt." Her words drew a few nods from those eager to stay in her favor, but others shifted uncomfortably. Calm was not the response of the cornered and guilty, not in a court that thrived on fear. It was unsettling. The stillness in Sari's tone carried an unexpected weight, as if she stood on solid ground while others floundered in uncertain waters. One of the guards hesitated, his boots squeaking faintly against the marble as he slowed. "Your Majesty," he began, If the girl? Silence, the queen snapped, the word striking through the air like a whip crack. Sari kept her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the queen, as though the ruler's fury could not quite reach her. If the wind wished to strike you, it is not by my will, she said. You gave me the branches and I obeyed. The wind is no servant of mine. Somewhere in the crowd, a low murmur rose, someone repeating her words, others agreeing under their breath. The queen heard it too, her jaw clenched so tightly the muscles quivered. You think to turn my own court against me, she said, her voice low now, dangerously low. You play the innocent, but your tongue is too steady, your eyes too bold. That is the sign of one who hides power. Her hand lifted, and for a moment it seemed she would give the order again, more forcefully. But the guards had not moved farther than halfway toward Sari. They stood caught between duty to their queen and a strange reluctance, glancing toward the uneasy faces in the crowd. One of the older nobles, a man with a hawk's profile and a cane topped with gold, spoke suddenly. If this girl has cursed you, Majesty, then the curse lies not in her hands, but in your own order. It was you who placed the thorns in her grasp. A ripple of shock moved through the room. The queen's glare snapped to him, but he did not lower his gaze. She has a tongue of silver, the queen hissed, and fools are quick to believe silver over truth. Sari took another small step forward, not toward the queen but toward the open space between them. The faintest draft stirred her hair, as though the wind still lingered somewhere in the rafters. I have no silver tongue, she said, only the truth. You can seize me, your majesty, but you cannot command the wind. Her voice was calm, unshaken, but in that calm there was something the court had never heard from a servant, a quiet defiance that did not beg or bargain. It made the queen's skin prickle. The queen's mouth twisted. Enough, she said, but her tone had lost a shade of its authority. The guards took another hesitant step. The tension in the room was like a drawn bowstring, any movement could release it into chaos. Some courtiers leaned forward as if unwilling to miss a moment, while others inched toward the walls, ready to slip away should the scene turn violent. Sari did not flinch, did not plead. Her stillness was the most dangerous thing in the room. And the queen, for all her bluster, felt the shift, power, subtle but real, moving in directions she could not control. The wind rustled again, just faintly, as though reminding them all of its presence. The court held its breath. The elder court advisor moved with a deliberate slowness, the steady tap of his carved staff echoing in the vast hall. Each step seemed to carry weight beyond the sound it made, and the murmurs in the court dimmed as heads turned toward him. His long robe trailed behind, its deep blue fabric embroidered with symbols most here had forgotten how to read. He had served under 3 rulers before the queen, his presence a relic of older, less gilded days, and when he chose to speak, people listened. He stopped just short of the dais, his aged eyes not seeking the queen's permission but locking on her gaze as though they were equals. The guards froze, their grip on their spears loosening. This is not the work of a servant's hand, he said, his voice low but resonant, like the deep tones of a temple bell. It is the wind that moved here. And the wind, your majesty, is not blind, it knows truth from falsehood, cruelty from fairness. The queen's lips tightened. You would claim this accident was a spirit's will? Not an accident, the elder replied. A spirit? Older than this court, older than this palace, older than the crown itself. The wind has always been the messenger of justice. It whispers to the righteous and strikes at the cruel. You know the old stories, majesty, though you choose not to tell them now. The wind answers to no throne. A shiver rippled through the watching courtiers. They had heard scraps of such tales as children, winds that guided lost travelers home, or tore the roofs from the houses of unjust lords. But such things were bedtime warnings, not matters for the throne room. The queen's knuckles whitened on the arms of her seat. You speak as though you are certain this spirit defends her. I am certain, he said, tilting his head slightly toward Sari. The wind does not serve beauty, nor power, nor rank. It serves only truth. And truth, majesty, is that this girl has done no wrong. She obeyed your command even as it tore at her flesh. Yet the wind turned its sting upon you. That is no curse of hers. It is the judgment of something greater. Sari stood motionless, listening. The words struck her like a strange warmth in the chest. She had never been defended so publicly, never been spoken of as someone worth protecting. The elder's voice grew firmer. You sit in the highest seat of the land, yet you are not beyond its reach. Harm her further, and you will draw down a wrath you cannot command, majesty. For the wind does not come alone, it calls the storms, the rains, the floods. And when they come, they do not choose between queen and peasant. They take all. The silence that followed was heavy, as if the air itself had grown thick. Even those who doubted spirits entirely found themselves swallowing hard, imagining the dark clouds that could roll over the palace walls. The queen's eyes flicked over the assembly, searching for allies, but too many had their eyes lowered. Others stared at her with guarded calculation. If there was truth to the elder's words, it would be dangerous to side openly against the wind's will. One young courtier whispered too loudly, "If it's the wind's doing, then striking her might be striking the spirit itself." His neighbor hissed at him to hush, but the words had already landed. Sari drew in a breath. Her hands still throbbed, but her voice when she spoke was steady. "I did not call for its help," she said softly, "but if it came to shield me, then I am grateful." The elder nodded once, as if her calm confirmed everything he had said. "The wind sees what we do even when we think no eyes are watching," he told the court. "And it remembers." The queen's face was a mask of control, but the flicker in her gaze betrayed unease. She had built her reign on command, on the certainty that her word alone was the highest law. Now, in front of her own court, something unseen and untouchable had dared to overrule her. For a long moment no one moved. The guards glanced between her and the elder, awaiting a command that would not doom them as well. At last the queen sat back, her voice tight. "Then let the spirit watch her," she said coldly. "But know this, old man, no wind can blow forever." The elder's eyes softened, not with agreement, but with the patience of someone who had seen storms last far longer than the arrogance that provoked them. "Perhaps," he said, "but some breezes become gales, and gales can topple even the highest walls." The court exhaled as though a taut rope had been cut. But beneath the release something had shifted, a whisper in the air, a new balance of power that no crown could fully contain. Sari returned to her duties with a measured calm that surprised many in the palace. The guards who once looked down on her now gave her brief nods of acknowledgement, and even some nobles whispered her name with a mix of awe and curiosity. Though her hands bore faint scars from the thorn branches she had held, those marks were now symbols of a trial overcome, a testament not only to her endurance but also to the mysterious protection she seemed to carry with her. The wind, subtle but ever-present, was like a silent guardian that seemed to stir softly whenever she moved through the palace halls. Curtains fluttered without breeze, flickering candles danced in her presence, and whispers of a spirit's favor floated through the courtiers' conversations. No one dared speak ill of her openly anymore. The tales of the thorn branches and the wind's retaliation had taken root deeply in the minds of all who witnessed them. Despite this newfound cautious respect, Sari remained as humble as ever. She did not let the fear or reverence of others change her. She carried out her tasks quietly, with steady hands and a composed spirit. She greeted fellow servants with gentle smiles and offered help to those struggling beneath the weight of court life's endless demands. Her strength was in her silence, in the grace with which she bore herself, never boasting, never complaining. This quiet dignity became her shield, more powerful than any spoken word. The queen, however, watched from her throne with a simmering mixture of jealousy and unease. Though she had ordered Sari's release and demanded her protection, she could not shake the bitter sting of having been undone by a servant and the forces she could not control. Every day the queen's eyes lingered on Sari longer than etiquette allowed, searching for signs of weakness or faltering. But Sari only grew steadier, more radiant in her simple resolve. The courtiers, ever perceptive, began weaving stories around Sari, stories of a girl who had endured cruelty and emerged touched by the very elements. Poets composed verses about the wind that protected the humble, while musicians sang songs that spread through the city beyond the palace walls. Mothers told their children about Sari, teaching them that true strength comes not from power or titles, but from kindness, endurance, and grace in the face of adversity. Among the palace staff, Sari became a quiet beacon of hope. She cared for the sick without complaint, shared her meager food with those who had less, and listened patiently when others sought comfort. Her presence softened the harshness of palace life, and even the most cynical servants found themselves drawn to her calm. The invisible wind seemed to echo her kindness, swirling gently through the kitchens and corridors as if in approval. Yet Sari never forgot the sharp thorns she had held, the pain and humiliation she endured. Instead of letting them harden her heart, those moments taught her compassion and patience. When she saw cruelty or injustice, she met it with quiet dignity rather than anger. Her actions spoke louder than words, inspiring others to act with more kindness and fairness. Time passed, and the story of Sari and the thorny branches became legend. The queen's court learned to respect her not out of fear alone, but because of the genuine goodness she embodied. Even when Sari's name was spoken in hushed tones, it carried a weight far greater than any title. She was no longer just a servant, she was a symbol, a reminder that humility and quiet strength could shift even the winds of fate. Years later, when Sari was no longer at the palace, the tale of her endurance and the protective wind lived on. New generations of servants and nobles alike would recount the story as a lesson in resilience and the unseen power that watches over those who remain true to themselves. Gardens were planted near the palace where the wind was said to be strongest, and a small statue was placed in the courtyard, a young girl holding thorn branches with a calm, determined expression. Sari's legacy was not built on grand speeches or battles fought in the open, but on the subtle, steady power of quiet triumph. She taught a kingdom that even in the face of cruelty, kindness and courage could move unseen forces, change hearts, and leave a lasting mark that no crown could erase.